Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're going to be exploring a place that's both fascinating and unsettling, Hill House. We've got excerpts from Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, plus some literary analysis about its place in the horror genre. We're going to uncover why this book is considered a masterpiece and explore that blurry line between a haunted house and a haunted mind. Ready to face your fears? Let's dive in.
Yeah, what immediately struck me was how Jackson creates a sense of unease even before anyone steps foot inside Hill House. It's like the house has a reputation that precedes it, casting a shadow over the characters before they even arrive.
Yeah, like that feeling you get when you walk past an old abandoned building
Yeah.
and you just know something isn't quite right. In the book, Hill House is this imposing 80-year-old mansion, isolated, dark, and with a history, right?
Right, and it draws these very different individuals to it. Dr. Montague, the academic obsessed with the supernatural, Eleanor Vance, shy and burdened by her past, Theodora, the free-spirited artist, and Luke Sanderson. The heir to Hill House, charming, but maybe not so reliable.
It's like each of them is bringing their own baggage to this already creepy place. And it's not just the characters. Even the house is described as almost a character itself. Jackson writes about its insistent hospitality, its seemingly dislikes letting its guests get away. Seriously chilling. What do you make of that?
It hints at the house's agency. This idea that it has a will of its own. And it feeds into that question that lingers throughout the book. Is the house truly haunted, or is it reflecting the anxieties and fears of its inhabitants?
You know, it just struck me. That scene where Eleanor drives past a house with stone lions and imagines herself living there, it's not just a random detail, is it?
Absolutely not. Jackson uses that seemingly innocent moment to give us a glimpse into Eleanor's deep-seated desires and anxieties.
Mm.
She pictures herself sweeping the porch, dusting those stone lions, serving silver tea and elderberry wine. It speaks volumes about her longing for belonging, for a place to call home.
And then there's the arrival at Hill House. It's almost like the tension cranks up a notch the moment they cross the threshold.
That arrival scene is so brilliantly unsettling. The encounter with Mrs. Dudley, the caretaker, is key. Her every word feels like a warning wrapped in a riddle. And then the house itself, with its doors slamming shut seemingly on their own. It's rooms that feel like they're shifting that disorienting architecture.
It's interesting how each character reacts to the house so differently. Theodora, for instance, has this visceral reaction. She wants to see the whole place burn down. What do you think that says about her, compared to, say, Eleanor?
That's a great observation. It speaks to their fundamental differences. Theodora, more independent and free-spirited, might see the house and its potential for fear as a challenge to be overcome. Eleanor, on the other hand, is drawn to the house, almost hypnotized by it. Perhaps she sees it as a refuge, a place of safety, despite its unsettling atmosphere, because she's so desperate for a sense of belonging.
And she seems particularly susceptible to whatever's going on in the house. There's that line where she wonders, how can these others hear the noise when it is coming from inside my head? That really blurs the line between what's real and what's imagined, doesn't it?
Precisely. And that's where Jackson's genius shines. She's tapping into that primal fear we all have. What if our own minds are the most terrifying places of all? It makes you question the nature of reality itself.
Okay, so we've got this creepy old house and these characters with their own personal baggage. But what's really going on here? Is the house truly evil? Or is it just reflecting the darkness within the characters?
That's the central question that Jackson wants us to grapple with. She's not giving us easy answers. It's not a simple ghost story with a clear-cut villain. The house becomes a mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities of each character. Eleanor, especially with her past trauma, her isolation, and her fraught relationship with her family, seems particularly susceptible to its influence.
Right, and there's that interesting contrast with Eleanor. On the surface, she seems happy at Hill House. Remember that line, "It is my second morning in Hill House, and I am unbelievably happy. Journeys end in lovers' meeting." But beneath that, there's this sense of unease, a feeling that something's not quite right.
Exactly. It's like she's desperately trying to convince herself that she's found a place where she belongs, a place where she can finally be accepted. But the cracks are already showing, and as the story unfolds, those cracks widen, revealing the darkness that's lurking beneath the surface.
And things do get pretty dark pretty quickly. We've got pounding on the doors, messages written in red paint, maybe even blood. And that terrifying night where the house seems to come alive, it feels like Jackson is taking all those subtle psychological anxieties and turning them into these visceral, terrifying experiences.
And it's worth noting that Jackson doesn't rely on cheap jump scares or gore. She builds suspense through atmosphere and psychological tension. The constant feeling of being watched, the bone-chilling cold that emanates from certain parts of the house, the disorienting architecture that makes you feel lost and trapped. It's a masterclass in creating a sense of dread that gets under your skin and stays with you.
It's not just what you see in Hill House, but what you feel.
Yeah.
That sense of unease, the feeling that something is lurking just beyond your perception. It's incredibly effective.
And that sense of dread is amplified by the way Jackson plays with the idea of isolation. Even when the characters are together, there's this underlying sense of loneliness, a feeling that they're not truly connecting.
It's like their loneliness makes them even more vulnerable to the influence of the house, right?
Right.
It's as if Hill House is feeding on their deepest desires and fears, offering a twisted sense of belonging in exchange for their sanity.
It's a chilling thought. And it speaks to the idea that the most terrifying monsters aren't always the ones lurking in the shadows, but the ones we carry within ourselves.
You know, it's interesting how the relationships between the characters add another layer to the unsettling atmosphere of Hill House.
That's a great point. The way they interact, the tensions that simmer beneath the surface, it all contributes to the feeling that something is off-kilter. Take Eleanor and Theodora, for instance.
Oh, their dynamic is fascinating. On the surface, there's a genuine affection between them, almost like they're drawn to each other in this strange environment. But underneath it all, there's a lot of tension, almost a sense of competition.
That's right. The literary analysis even suggests that Jackson drew on her own complicated relationship with her mother when creating Eleanor.
That makes a lot of sense. Eleanor is constantly battling these feelings of inadequacy, like she's never good enough, never truly wanted, and her interactions with Theodora often highlight that.
There's a scene that really stood out to me. When Theodora paints Eleanor's toenails, it seems like a simple, almost tender moment. But then Eleanor says something really revealing. I hate having things done to me. I don't like to feel helpless. My mother, it's like a sudden flash of vulnerability, a glimpse into her deep-seated anxieties and her fear of losing control.
It's those little moments, those seemingly insignificant interactions that really give you insight into the character's inner turmoil. And then there's that scene where Theodora suggests that Eleanor might be responsible for the strange occurrences.
Ooh, yes. That's when things get really explosive between them. It's interesting, though, because it almost feels like Theodora is onto something. Like she senses a darkness in Eleanor that Eleanor herself might not even be aware of.
That connects to the idea of the psychological ghost story that we were discussing earlier. It's not just about external threats, but also about the monsters we harbor within ourselves.
Exactly. And in Eleanor's case, it's that repressed rage, that fear of her own power that might be the most terrifying thing of all. It makes you wonder what would happen if she fully embraced that darkness.
It's a chilling thought. And speaking of chilling thoughts, we can't forget about the male characters. Luke and Dr. Montague, they also have their own vulnerabilities that the house seems to exploit.
Absolutely. Luke, with all his charm and roguish behavior, is actually quite insecure about his place in the world. The analysis points out that he even admits to never feeling truly loved for who he is.
And his connection to Hill House, the fact that it's his inheritance, becomes almost symbolic. It's like he's trying to claim something that has always eluded him, a sense of belonging, a place where he truly fits in.
And then there's Dr. Montague, whose obsession with the supernatural might be masking some deeper anxieties. What do you make of that?
You know, I've been wondering about that. It's as if his fascination with the paranormal is a way of grappling with the big questions, the mysteries of the universe that science can't fully explain. Maybe he's drawn to the house because it represents the unknown, the things that lie beyond our understanding.
That's a really insightful observation.
And
And let's not forget that his marriage isn't exactly a fairy tale romance. The arrival of his wife, Mrs. Montague, throws a wrench into the already delicate dynamic at Hill House.
oh, Mrs. Montague. She's like a force of nature, completely disrupting the fragile equilibrium that's been established. She's controlling, dismissive of her husband's work, and determined to prove her own psychic abilities.
She represented this intrusion of the outside world into the already isolated world of Hill House. And her interactions with Eleanor are, well, let's just say they don't exactly hit it off.
It's almost like Mrs. Montague is completely oblivious to the subtle psychological forces at play. She's like a bull in a china shop, blundering through this delicate ecosystem of anxieties and fears.
And then there's the planchette. Her insistence on using it to contact the spirits only adds to the chaos. Remember that chilling scene?
Oh, absolutely. It starts with these seemingly harmless messages, but then it takes a dark turn. The messages become fixated on Eleanor calling her Nellie, and using this language of longing and loss, talking about home and mother. It's like something in the house is reaching out to her, trying to lure her in.
The messages seem to tap into Eleanor's deepest desires and fears. It's almost as if the house or whatever entity might be residing there is feeding off her vulnerability, using her longing for belonging to manipulate her.
And the most disturbing message of all is when they ask the planchette what it wants, and it simply replies, home. That sends shivers down my spine every time I read it.
It's such a simple word, but in the context of the story, it takes on this incredibly sinister meaning. It suggests that whatever is haunting Hill House might not be a traditional ghost, but something far more insidious, something that feeds on loneliness and despair and offers a twisted, dangerous form of belonging.
It really highlights how Jackson blurs the lines between reality and imagination. Is the planchette actually communicating with a supernatural entity, or is it simply acting as a conduit for the character's subconscious desires and fears?
That ambiguity is what makes the story so compelling and terrifying. It leaves us questioning not only the events within the novel, but also the nature of our own perceptions and the limits of our understanding.
And as the tension mounts, the hauntings escalate to a terrifying climax. Jackson uses all these subtle psychological anxieties and turns them into these visceral, terrifying experiences. The pounding on the doors, the messages written in red paint that night where the house seems to come alive. It's a masterclass in building suspense and dread.
It's important to note how Jackson uses sensory details to create this heightened sense of dread. The cold, the darkness, the feeling of being watched. These elements work together to build an almost unbearable atmosphere of suspense.
Yes, like that bone-chilling cold that emanates from certain parts of the house. It's not just physically uncomfortable, it's also deeply unsettling. It's like a physical manifestation of the spiritual emptiness, the coldness at the heart of the house.
And let's not forget the disorienting architecture of Hill House. Staircases that twist in on themselves, rooms that feel claustrophobic and oppressive. It's like the house itself is designed to disorient and confuse its inhabitants.
It's like the house is a labyrinth, both physically and psychologically. The characters are trapped not only within its walls, but also within their own minds, unable to escape the maze of their own fears and desires.
And then, of course, there's the writing on the wall. Those messages that appear in Theodore's room, seemingly written in blood. It's such a classic horror trope, but Jackson uses it to devastating effect.
Those messages are so personal, so threatening, and they target Eleanor directly. It's like whatever is haunting the house knows her deepest desires and fears and is using them against her.
Remember what they say. Help Eleanor come home, Eleanor. And then even more chillingly, journeys end in lovers' meeting. It's a twisted manipulation of Eleanor's longing for belonging and connection.
It's as if the house is offering her a perverse kind of love, a dangerous embrace that threatens to consume her entirely.
And that brings us to one of the most unsettling aspects of The Haunting of Hill House. It's not just a story about a haunted house, but about the ways in which our own minds can become our prisons, our torturers.
So we've talked a lot about the dark side of Hill House, but what about those fleeting moments of beauty and joy that the characters experience? There are times when they seem to find genuine connection and happiness, even in the midst of this unsettling atmosphere.
That's what makes the story so complex and compelling. The darkness is always present. But there are these glimmers of light moments of connection and laughter that make the characters and the reader question whether there's any hope of escaping the shadows.
Like that scene where Eleanor, Theodora, and Luke have a picnic by the brook. It's a brief respite from the oppressive atmosphere of the house. They're playful, relaxed, almost carefree.
It's as if they've found a temporary escape from the darkness, a moment of normalcy in the midst of chaos.
But even in that idyllic setting, there's a sense of foreboding, a feeling that the darkness is never far away.
Exactly. And it's those moments of contrast, those shifts between light and shadow, that make The Haunting of Hill House such a masterful work of psychological horror. Jackson shows us that even in the darkest of places there can be moments of beauty, even if they're fleeting.
And those moments make the descent into darkness even more tragic. Which brings us back to Eleanor's final, fateful decision to stay with Hill House.
Even though she's given a chance to leave, to escape the grip of the house, she chooses to surrender to it. It's a choice that has captivated and puzzled readers for decades.
It's a heartbreaking choice, but also in a strange way, a triumphant one. It's like she's finally found a place where she truly belongs, even if that place is ultimately her undoing.
And the analysis suggests that Eleanor's choice is a reflection of Jackson's own worldview, which was often pessimistic and even nihilistic.
That's a lot to unpack, but I think it's important to remember that even though The Haunting of Hill House is a horror story, it's also a deeply human one.
Exactly. It's a story about loneliness, about fear, about the search for belonging. And those are themes that resonate with all of us, whether we've ever set foot on a haunted house or not.
So we've been talking about Eleanor's choice to stay at Hill House, and it seems like there's a lot to unpack there. Is it a defeat or a strange kind of victory?
That's one of the things that makes The Haunting of Hill House so enduring. You know it's a story that stays with you and keeps you thinking long after you finish reading it. Jackson never gives us easy answers. She leaves us with this lingering question. Is Eleanor's fate a tragedy? Or is there a twisted kind of triumph in her finding a place where she finally feels she belongs?
It's almost like Jackson is saying, hey, reader, you decide. What do you make of this?
Exactly. And that ambiguity is a hallmark of what's called the psychological ghost story.
Okay, I remember you mentioned that term earlier, but I'm still not entirely clear on what it means. Can you break it down for me?
Sure. A psychological ghost story, unlike a more traditional ghost story, isn't so much about whether ghosts are real or not. It's more about blurring the lines between the mind and the external world. The focus is on the characters' internal states, their fears, their desires, their traumas, and how those things shape their perception of reality.
So in The Haunting of Hill House, it's not just about whether the house is actually haunted. It's also about how Eleanor's own anxieties and past experiences might be influencing what she sees and hears. It's like the house is a canvas onto which she's projecting her own inner turmoil.
Precisely. And because the story is told primarily from Eleanor's increasingly unreliable point of view,
Yeah.
we as readers are constantly questioning what's real and what's imagined. That ambiguity is what makes it so unsettling. It makes you wonder, what if we can't even trust our own perceptions? What if the monsters we fear most are the ones we create within ourselves?
That's a pretty disturbing thought. It makes me think about those moments in the book where the line between reality and delusion becomes completely blurred for Eleanor. Like when she feels trapped, overwhelmed, and says, it's inside my head and it's getting out, getting out, getting out.
That's a perfect example of how Jackson uses language to create a sense of psychological unease. We're right there with Eleanor experiencing her descent into madness, and it's terrifying.
And speaking of literary techniques, the analysis we're looking at mentions a connection between Shirley Jackson's work and Henry James, particularly his novella, The Turn of the Screw.
Yes, that's another classic example of the psychological ghost story. Both Jackson and James were masters of using ambiguity and unreliable narrators to create a sense of dread and uncertainty in the reader.
Can you give me an example of how they achieve that similar effect?
Sure, think about the ending of The Turn of the Screw. We're left wondering, did the governess actually see ghosts? Or was she simply projecting her own repressed desires and anxieties onto the children in her care? It's a question that has been debated by literary scholars for over a century.
So it's the same kind of unsettling uncertainty that Jackson creates with Eleanor and Hill House. We're never quite sure what's real and what's not, and that makes the story all the more terrifying. And like you mentioned earlier, it seems like Jackson's own life experiences might have influenced her exploration of these dark themes.
The analysis suggests that Jackson's own complicated relationship with her mother, as well as her struggles with isolation and anxiety, likely informed her writing. It's fascinating to consider how personal experiences can shape an artist's vision, and how those personal demons can be transformed into powerful and sometimes disturbing works of art.
That makes me think about the theme of loneliness that runs through so much of The Haunting of Hill House. Each character in their own way seems deeply isolated from the others. Even when they try to connect, there's this underlying sense of unease, a feeling that they're not truly being seen or understood.
Exactly. And that isolation makes them more susceptible to the influence of the house. It's as if their loneliness creates a void that Hill House is able to fill, even if that ultimately leads to their destruction.
It's like the house is offering a perverse kind of belonging, a dangerous embrace that promises to fulfill their deepest needs but ultimately demands a terrible price.
And that brings us back to the central question that Jackson raises in The Haunting of Hill House. What is it that we truly long for? And what are we willing to sacrifice in order to find it?
So after all of this, after diving deep into this unsettling story, what are we left with? What's the takeaway for us, the listeners?
I think The Haunting of Hill House offers us a powerful and thought-provoking meditation on the human condition. It forces us to confront our own inner demons, those hidden fears and desires that we often try to suppress. It reminds us that the scariest monsters aren't always the ones lurking in the shadows, but the ones we carry within ourselves.
It makes you think about the places you find comfort in, the people you let into your life, and the shadows you might be hiding from, both within yourself and in the world around you.
And ultimately, I think it reminds us that we all have a choice. We can choose to face our fears, to embrace the light, even in the darkest of places. Or we can surrender to the darkness, allowing it to consume us entirely.
Well, that's a chilling thought to end on. But it's also a powerful one. It makes you realize that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, we still have the power to choose our own path.
And sometimes that choice, that act of defiance,
Yeah.
is the most terrifying thing of all.
So what do you think? Are the places we seek refuge in truly safe? Or are they just waiting to reveal the darkness within us? Sleep tight and sweet dreams, if you dare.